Hello, I'm going to be presenting to you the solution for a travel company who are looking to replace their existing systems with Salesforce. So let's get right into it and start off with a list of our actors and licenses. So we have two different types of external users, the first of which is tour operators. So these are the people who submit their suggested travel plans or travel packages to the travel company for sale. So tour operators, there are about 500 companies, and they have 20 employees each, giving us about 10,000 users overall. They'll need a partner community license in order to interact, which, as we'll see in the requirements later. We also have the customers, who are our adventurers. Currently, they're expecting 300,000 of those to register in the first year, and they will need a customer community license. Internally, we have the travel operator coordinators, the TOCs. They're effectively our account managers, and they will require a sales license, Sales Cloud. We also have our account schedulers. These are the people who schedule the dates and availability of the different packages. They will need a Service Cloud. We also have our service agents who will assist our adventurers should they have inquiries or any problems. So there are service controllers, SCs. They're going to require a Service Cloud license as well. We have a management layer, which is done by region, so our RMs. They should be fine with a standard Salesforce Sales Cloud license. And then finally, we have one other external user, which is tour guides. These are independent advisors which are brought into the process, and they participate in the tour. So they will need a partner community license. Okay, so if we talk about the existing systems, the existing and future systems within the company. So there's a number of existing systems which will be retired. There were some which will be integrated, and then there will be a number of new systems which will be required. So if we start off with our target system of Salesforce, and that will have a community capability for our external users. Existing systems, we have the current payment system, which is on-prem. So if we indicate the firewall here, that system is called PaymentForce. The current identity solution for employees is Active Directory, which is also on-prem. And there's an additional identity store, which is an LDAP store for the tour operators. The tour operators themselves have their own systems, of which there are many in the varied uses of technology. And these will require to be integrated into our new solution. Given that there's a large number of diverse number of systems that would be involved, a suitable solution here would be to make use of a cloud ESB. So an example of that would be MuleSoft. This will give us the ability to produce for the tour operators our own API, our own set of services which we can make available in order for the operators to integrate their systems either in partnership with us or self-serving, making use of that API. In terms of the connection between the Cloud ESB and Salesforce, we'll want to make use of two-way SSL in order to assure, to establish trust between the two systems. This will be achieved through an X509 certificate. Another existing system is Service Pro, and this system is used to schedule and facilitate the response to any service activity requests from adventurers. I propose to connect that also to the ESB, thereby giving us a common centralized point for our integrations. There are some systems to be retired. Existing Salesforce Sales Cloud is in use in several of the regions across the business. I propose that we will retire these systems and migrate the data into our new central Salesforce instance. And I would propose that this is a single org solution across the supporting multiple regions around the world. So we'll migrate the data. The existing tour management system, which is a .NET solution, will be retired, and we will migrate the data into our central Salesforce. And we'll come on to looking at the data migration requirements shortly. There's a few other systems. So in terms of identity and access management, so we have the LDAP store for the partners and the AD for the customers. My proposal would be to make use of a cloud IDAM. So for example, Okta. And this achieves several things for us. First of all, it provides the ability to connect Active Directory and make it available to our other systems, so Salesforce being the primary one. So this IDAM will be our IDP for Salesforce users. We then have an opportunity here either to integrate the LDAP store into the same cloud IDAM or to retire it completely and actually move that capability to the cloud and have the credentials stored there. That would actually be my preference from the point of view of simplifying the landscape. So we'll move that to the cloud IDAM. There's a couple of third-party solutions which will help in meeting the requirements. So the first of those is cloud storage. So, for example, Google Drive or Box, and that will be integrated with Salesforce using Files Connect. And we'll examine the requirements that will make use of that later on. There's also a need for an e-signature solution. So, for example, Adobe Sign or DocuSign. Both of these have integration, pre-built integrations with Salesforce that are available to us. So this will be used wherever the adventurers need to provide a signature for a disclaimer or a waiver for risky activities. System remains unchanged is the GAT website. So this is the main website for the travel company. They will continue to use that, and we will provide the appearance of a seamless integration with our Salesforce community, and this will be experienced in the user's browser. For the users, they can access the system in two ways, either through a browser or through a mobile device. and that will give them access to both the GAP website and the Salesforce community. We'll look in detail about the requirements of the mobile app, but it seems a hybrid mobile app will be suitable for the requirements that have been stated. Last one is a survey system, a survey tool for customer satisfaction surveys for post-case close. So something like a get feedback, for example, would meet the need here. Again, that has a pre-built integration with Salesforce, which will allow us to conduct those surveys and get the results back into Salesforce. So that's the landscape. If we just return then to our users and the ways in which they'll access Salesforce, if we look at the role hierarchy, so at the top we have our regional managers. So the company is divided up into 7 divisions around the world. So Australia, Asia, Europe, Middle East, etc., etc. I propose that at the top level of the role hierarchy there will be the regional manager for each of these regions. So that just goes on times 5 more. And then for each of the regions, we have the reporting structure underneath, which is divided into 3 levels. We have our account owners, who are our TOCs. We have our service agents. And then we have our adventure specialists. I think I left them off of our list of users. So the adventure specialists are the people who coordinate the arrangement of the bookings for adventurers and between adventurers and travel operators. So I think that's the service agents, that's the adventure specialists, and they will require a service cloud. So our adventure specialists within the role hierarchy there. So that's the internal user, the internal users. And then for our external users, they'll need to interact in the following ways. So for the travel operators, these will be partner accounts. And so the account will be owned by a TOC user, effectively is the account manager for each of their accounts. Within the travel operators world, they can make use of partner roles in order to have a manager and the additional layers of staff inside their own organisation. The adventure specialists need to interact with the tour guide users. So they will own the account which relates to the tour guide, even though it's likely just to be a one-to-one relationship. And so in that way, when we get onto the data model, this will allow the travel operators and the tour guides to access the information inside the organisation that they have need of accessing. The last set of users who are, because they're customer community users, are outside of the hierarchy, but I'll put them on for completeness, is the adventurers. And we will grant access where needed through the appropriate sharing techniques. Okay, so the last thing is data model. So we have a number of standard objects and a couple of custom objects that we need to make use of in the solution. So starting in the center with the account. These will be owned by TOC users, and there's about 500 of those. We will also have opportunities, and the opportunity will also be owned by the TOC. This will represent the package offers that the tour operators are putting forward, and that will go through a review process. So there's about 2,000 of those. And then the packages that they offer can run on a number of dates. We can make use of opportunity line items to represent that. There's normally 10 dates per package in the year, so that gives us about 20,000 records there. Supporting the opportunity line item structure, we will need the appropriate Salesforce standard product representation. So that's product, price book, and price book entry. We also have a requirement come onto whereby we can make use of recommendations. Recommendations will be made with reference to a product, so there'll be a custom relationship, custom lookup relationship between recommendation and product. Qualification process will make use of leads. There are many thousands of those mentioned, but this will be relatively short-lived. And then from a customer support point of view, we'll have need of case for customer support needs. There's also a requirement for entitlements. So we'll need entitlements and entitlement contact. Let's get the contact on here. So our contact for our accounts, entitlement contact, which can then be used in the case. Additionally, when customers book, it will be against an instance of a particular package. So at a product level, this will be a booking. I propose that would be a custom object. Which is related to the opportunity line item, essentially the product for which they're, the date period for which they're booking. And then it will be the contact that will be making that booking. Will have need of a additional direct relationship to account for sharing purposes. I've drawn the crow's feet the wrong way around there, sorry. There we go. In terms of numbers for the booking, based on the description within the scenario, it's likely that we could get up to 1 million records in the booking table at any one year. So therefore we'll need some kind of an archiving strategy here. Given that this is a hotspot in the area and that bookings are fairly transitory, once they're done, they can be moved off. We've got an opportunity here to make use of a big object. So the big object will be used to store historical booking information, and the key of, or the index of the big object will allow the parent records, so the parent account records, to be able to access this. in order that users can review their booking or internal users can review their booking. So that's the landscape, the data model, our users and our role hierarchy. Let's turn now to looking at the requirements in some more detail. So on page 3 of the scenario, we have our proposed business processes, so tour order management. So first requirement describes the application process from tour operators. There's a couple of ways that I see this could be done. This could either be done with a web to lead or a web to case. I think the considerations here around which one is the right one is balancing what the purpose of the transaction is and also the capabilities that we need. So the need to be able to assign in a round robin manner, we could make use of omnichannel queue routing here, but that would probably be overkill. So I would say in that case, we'll go for a lead with a custom assignment process, which could be done using a third-party solution or Apex. The third requirement, GAP would like to capture supporting documentation, including certificates. Typically, files are less than 10 megabytes in size. So I think, given the size and the quantity of these, Salesforce files will be sufficient. I should say I forgot to put that on the data model. So we need to make use of Salesforce files related to our account and whichever other objects it needs to be related to. So that one's Salesforce files. GAP would like TOCs to be able to collaborate with each other on the registration request. This can be achieved with Chatter. The verification today done with spreadsheets now needs to be done in a more structured manner. So this solution would involve several platform features. So I think initially formula fields could be used to calculate the composite values for the risk level of tours, number of fatalities in industry, number of fatalities that may have occurred or may occur. So that would give us our input data. And then if the resulting score is greater than 50, so effectively this is lead scoring of a sort. So an adventure specialist needs to be notified. So we're now looking to escalate the qualification process to a local adventure specialist. So this could be achieved through use of a process builder in order to change the owner. And the same process could then make use of an email template to send the email to them, giving them an email could then be set up. Hold on a sec. The adventure specialist can then update the lead record with their proposed date, and then a process could be used on the status change of the lead in order to use an email template to send the tour operator an email with their proposed visit date. And then the lead can either be approved or cancelled. So this would be a quick action which is accessible on Salesforce One, so they need to be able to do it on their mobile device. If they do then approve the lead, this will then fire the lead convert process in order to create the account and contact for the new account, and optionally an opportunity if they've got a particular initial package ready to go. If there's no escalation required, so if the score is less than 50, or the when the follow-up has been complete, it can then be submitted for approval. So sorry, I got ahead of myself there. So the conversion only happens subsequent to an approval. So this would be where the AS would make use of a quick action to update the record, which would then fire a process builder, which could then send the approval process to the required RM. And that would be defined based on the region that the processing is taking place. Once approved, the TOC onboards the tour operator. So the tour operator details will be automatically copied from the registration request. This could be achieved by use of a headless flow in order to take the source data and copy it into multiple target objects. So I think on this basis, we might want something a little bit more than the standard lead convert process. So it will be possible to make use of a flow to implement that logic. System should create a letter in local language for the tour operator, welcoming them. So this could be achieved through the use of a process builder firing off an email template. So we do have, with our 7 geographies, we have a multi-language requirement here. So during system implementation, we'll want to make sure that we are ready for the use of Translation Workbench, and then any programmatic assets that are created we'll need to make use of custom labels in order to support our multi-language. Likewise, email templates will be produced in multiple languages and the appropriate template used for a particular region. The tour operator's contacts are set up as a creditor in the Payment Force system. Okay, so this is an integration which will take place. So let's just walk through that now. So the creditor will be set up in the Payment Force system, and a transaction will take place, and then the creditor ID which is created will need to be returned back to Salesforce and placed in the account record. So this would be achieved by the transaction starting on Salesforce. So the record would be updated to a particular status. We could then make use of a standard outbound message firing into the ESB. The ESB would then be able to broker the transaction to contact Service Pro with the information about the creditor and the amount to be debited, and then wait for a response. When that response comes back, it can make use of the session ID that was in the outbound message in order to update the Salesforce account record with the new values. Tour proposal and scheduling. So approved tour operators will request a proposed tour and then set up tour dates in the new application. So this is our opportunity and opportunity line items. They're accessing this through the partner community. So the opportunity will be owned by their partner account, so they'll have access to it through that route. Proposed tours go through a negotiation process. So these would be the opportunity stages. Tour operator can specify maximum capacity and 12-month scheduled date. So this would be achieved through custom fields on the opportunity and the opportunity line item. Any AS for the region can review the proposed tour and their schedule. They'd like a user-friendly method for the tour guides to review and update the status of multiple tour requests at once. So the tour guides will be able to access the tours to which they've been given access via their partner community, and then they should be able to, or they will be able to use a list view and a quick action in order to change the status of multiple records. Where do we get to? The proposed system should automatically check that tour guides are not double booked. So this could be achieved through use of some custom Apex with an Apex trigger in order to make sure that the date for which they are updating doesn't overlap any existing records that they're already committed to. There's a requirement to create a pre-formatted PDF that displays the tour and schedule information. So I think the considerations around this requirement, I think, are need to take into account the number of languages which might be involved, and the maintenance of different assets and different versions of this PDF. So I think my assumption here is that they're going to want to produce something that's pretty high quality, and they're also going to want to have a sustainable maintenance process around this, a business process to maintain this. So therefore I would recommend the use of external document production systems, so something like a Conga Composer or a draw loop. I didn't put that on the landscape here, so I will just add it now. And again, if we go with a third-party provider that has a built-in integration with Salesforce, that means that we've got a ready-to-go solution. Once the AS has completed their review, then the credit account is... did we do that one? Yes, we did do that one. Okay, so that was the last requirement on page 3, was around the... oh no, sorry, this is the additional interaction with Paymentforce. So once the AS has completed their review, so the creditors account is debited in the Paymentforce with the amount that is set up regionally. So within Salesforce, on the account record, we've got the creditor ID from the previous transaction. So the AS now is completing the transaction and will need a response in real time. So there's a couple of ways that we could do this. We need to have it be driven from the UI. So we're looking at the use of a web service call out from Salesforce. Now we could either go directly to Service Pro, or we could go via the ESB. Now there's some additional things to bear in mind here around the governance of the integration of changes around Service Pro. As we will look at later, there is quite a rigorous process around work relating to, sorry, not Service Pro, Paymentforce, which I didn't wire in, and I probably confused you all greatly. So the previous one where we were getting the creditor ID is targeting Paymentforce, not Service Pro, sorry. We're now going to Paymentforce to actually do a billing transaction. I'm going to go via the ESB. My rationale for that is that this integration with Paymentforce is the one that can be done one time and go through the relevant due diligence process, and we're then able to be more flexible in terms of the scheduling of the delivery work in terms of delivering for this requirement. So I managed to, I've decoupled these two dependencies. Both of these connections will be enabled with 2ASSL in order to establish trust. And so back to the flow, which will go via the ESB. So the user will be on their screen with they will initiate the transaction, which will call an Apex call out, which will target the ESB. That will then broker the transaction to debit the account within Paymentforce and wait for the response, and then give the reply back here to Salesforce. I think we'll need to look at the amount of time that's involved in this transaction. If it's going to be a particularly long-running transaction, then there's some techniques we could make use of within Salesforce. For example, a Visualforce continuation that can hold the connection between Salesforce and the ESB longer, so that we can get a reply. Okay, page 4. An email notification is sent to the tour operator with both the tour details and its schedules. So I think this is another example where there could be potentially quite a rich amount of information which is required. So even though it's specified here as an email notification, I would think, but depending on the level of information that's required, but I would look to be making use of the document production system to produce a PDF which could be attached to the email. Then that simplifies the maintenance of the email templates for each of the regions, but the email template will allow us to send that message. Last requirement for this one, tour operator can mark the tour to auto-renew each year, in which case a new set of tour dates will be automatically created. There's a couple of governing factors around that. My proposal would be to make use of batch Apex that's run on a monthly basis, and that would look at the various values and apply the business rules as to whether or not a new opportunity line item records would be created for 12 months in the future, or whenever they want to run it. So, perhaps it's run 6 months in advance, and that, the records would be created then. Turning now to the adventurers. Requirements around the adventurer requests. So an adventurer should be able to view and search for published tours and view their schedules on a mobile device. So this would be, they would be able to do this by looking at the product records within through their customer community. They'll be able to filter based on risk level, location, etc. So this could be achieved through the use of list view filters. There's a requirement for a global map, so this could be achieved using a custom component, either written in-house or sourced externally, in order to represent the data. So within the product table, we would look to have some custom fields for these categorizations and location of the particular tour. In addition, the adventurer can request that the system suggest tours for them that are based on the types and number of tours that they've booked in the past 5 years. So this could make use of next best action feature with reference to the recommendations object. So the business analysis will be required to work out different criteria that could be applied in terms of the recommendations, but we can then produce a set of recommendations which are associated with the products, and then this could be displayed to the adventurer through their customer community page with a standard or a custom component. Second requirement for adventurer support. At times, adventurers will get into trouble and require assistance. So there's a pool of service coordinators, so cases can be directed to them based on skills, so we can use omnichannel skills-based routing for that. Then there's a number of requirements which relate to different SLAs, so this will make use of entitlements. There's also milestones which are needed, so these are all the qualifying reasons that service coordinators will need to make use of Service Cloud licenses in order to achieve this. Last one on page 4, calculates the number of assistance requests that are the fault of the tour operator, and if more than 10 occur in any 1 year. So this is a feedback loop on the tour operator. So based on the case type, when the case is closed, a flow can be fired, and this can be used then to update the account record. They like to track feedback and performance of service coordinators. So this will make use of our external CSAT application and the integration to go with. So something like a get feedback will do that very nicely. Data migration. So we've got some points really around data quality and the need to migrate from the existing tour management system into Salesforce. So we'll do that through a dedicated data migration work stream, which will look at the transformation rules which are required and apply those using an ETL tool. We'll also need to perform a data cleanse in order to dedupe and possibly enrich that data as well. There's also a time dependency on the migration. So during cutover, it's expected that it may take up to a week to run this process. In order to prevent downtime, what we'll do is we'll do an initial load into Salesforce a week before, and then at the point of cutover, we'll look to load the delta from the TMS into Salesforce. In terms of how the users will access the system, so accessibility requirements on page 5. So single sign-on based on internal Active Directory for the staff. So I've said that we'll connect that using the standard connector to sync credentials to Okta, so they'll still be able to manage the user setup using Active Directory, but the connector will take care of the user provisioning and deprovisioning. Users will then be able to log into Salesforce via Okta using either SP init or IDP init SAML. Ahead of time, we will have set up the SAML connection between Salesforce and our Cloud IDAM. So we will have taken over the X509 certificate. We'll make sure that the clocks of the systems are within 5 minutes of each other. That should take care of it. User provisioning in Salesforce. So we've got two options here. If we go for, let's say it's Okta, if we go for the basic version, we can use a custom Apex JIT provisioner within Salesforce itself in order to set up the user within the system based on attributes inside the SAML request. So this would be typically their Active Directory group, but something which is worth possibly the additional consideration of more money is there's a connector which will do that automatically, and Okta will take care of provisioning the users. That would be my choice if we had no restriction on money. Tour operator credentials are stored in LDAP. I'm proposing that we move those directly to our Cloud IDAM, and then tour operators will make use of SAML again to authenticate themselves via Okta with Salesforce. GAT would like seamless SSO using the service coordinator's credentials in the new system to Service Pro. So this is service users within Salesforce wanting to access information inside Service Pro. This will be achieved by virtue of a service provider initiated SAML flow. Customers should register and sign on using a new application using Facebook. So we have a social sign-on requirement here. So we would set up the authentication providers within Salesforce and then create an Apex class in order to be able to provision the users based on the information that we get from the authentication provider. So typically this would be their email, first name, last name, that we could then put into their customer record in Salesforce and then have them be set up. Customers should be required not to re-enter their credentials within the mobile application. So this requirement suggests to me that having use of accessing the customer community through a mobile browser experience is not going to be good enough. They're going to need to sign in every time. So in that case, we're going to need to make use of a hybrid mobile app in order to achieve that. Shall we stop there? And we nearly got the end.
Do you want to take a minute? before we start Q&A?
You're just saying that because I said that to you the other day, aren't you?
Because that's what everyone says.
Yes, thank you. Okay, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Right, so my first question is around your choice of solution for scheduling and tours. So you've talked about how tour operators will put in a request for a new tour and potential dates. Could you just talk me through how you plan to solution that request in Salesforce?
Yeah, so the tour itself will be an opportunity record, and then they can propose up to 10 dates, or they can run that tour 10 times in the year. I see those 10 records, those 10 instances being opportunity line items within Salesforce. So this would be the tour to Machu Picchu. This would be the 10 times a year it runs, and then the product would be representing how that product or how that is visible to an adventurer. So the adventurers need to be able to filter by particular products. Then they need to find out how many, they're really interested in the 10 instances that will run. Whereas the opportunity is more generally what the tour operator is selling.
Okay, so visualizing that in Salesforce, you would have an opportunity. Each line item would have a product, which is the date.
No, so the dates would be custom fields. The product would be, Machu Picchu to, 2019.
Right, okay. So if I'm a customer and I'm logging into the community, into the customer community, I would just see a list of products and it would say Machu Picchu 2019.
With each of the dates. So those custom fields with the start date and end date would be the item which is more relevant there. Well, not relevant, but it completes the picture. So you would see the one for January, the one for February, the one for March, and you could choose which one you wanted to go on.
Okay, and then equally, if I looked at the opportunity on the internal side, I would see 10 line items.
Yeah.
Each with 10 different products, one for January, one for February, one for March.
Yeah.
Okay, that's clarified it. Thank you. Okay. Could you mentioned you were going to integrate using two-way SSL. Could you explain the reason that you selected that particular security level of security?
Yeah, so I think whenever possible it's preferable to do that, but I think what's important here is that this is a payment system, and so we want to make sure that the payment system is certain of who is making calls to it, and so use of the X509 certificate allows the sharing of trust.
Okay. You also positioned Files Connect in your system landscape. Talk us through how that would be used.
So I didn't get to the requirement, but there is mention of a requirement whereby adventurers can share their photos. So the consideration that I had here was that there's a large number of adventurers, probably a large number of photos. So therefore I would be proposing using an external store for those assets, but I would like them to be accessible to Salesforce and the community. So Files Connect would allow us to provide that integration so that the community users, for example, would have the URL to a photograph, and therefore that could be rendered in the UI.
Okay, so what's the experience that the customer has in the app then to upload the photo?
So they would make use of so it's going to be a hybrid mobile app. So that would allow file system access. So they would be able to take the photograph and then they would be able then to upload that image. I guess there's a choice here as to whether or not they uploaded it initially to Salesforce and then we look to offload that. But I think actually in this instance, the Files Connect integration is going to take care of that because we've already got an established integration between Salesforce platform and the external file store. So the record will be written into, or the existence of the record will be written into the files object, and then the integration will take care of handing the binary off to the external store.
And what will happen to the files after they've been moved over to the external store?
The URL is accessible in terms of Salesforce query, or within Salesforce, the URL is accessible, and therefore that would allow the binary image to be retrieved.
Thank you. Any other questions from Miriam and Jig?
Yeah. Yes. You mentioned that the tour operators would be maintaining access to their own system. And on the other hand, you mentioned the partner portal. So what would you see tour operators doing in the partner portal versus in their own existing system? Right.
So this is kind of a dealership model. So I think one of the requirements that's called out is a desire to standardize processes. So by providing the portal, we're providing them with the processes and the facilities in order to do the tasks, the business tasks that we need them to do. There's some requirements listed whereby tour operators would like to be able to place orders into our Salesforce system, create bookings inside our Salesforce system. So just the same as adventurers can create a booking, I would see tour operators being able to do that en masse. So if they have, for example, taken bookings within their system, they are then able to hand those off over to the booking object in Salesforce, and we would facilitate that in a managed way through the ESB to provide them with a standard API that they could make use of, or we could do custom integration, depending on how valuable that tour operator is, and then that allows the streamlining of that process for them.
Yep. All right. Thank you. Are there any particular recommendations in terms of phasing this implementation? You want to get rid of a few systems? Do you want to do everything at the same time, or any considerations there?
Yes, there are a number of considerations with reference to that. So on the last page, on page 6, it goes into the detail of the siloed environment that we're going to have to work in. So I think this really comes down to the implementation approach, which takes into consideration how the internal IT and external IT existing teams are going to work together. We've also got the different streams of work that we need to do. So the Salesforce build itself, in terms of addressing the majority of these business requirements, that could be conducted in an agile manner, in collaboration with the different stakeholders to prioritize. However, when it comes to the data migration, the integration with Paymentforce, and also the Sales Cloud migration, so the existing Salesforce orgs that we're going to get rid of, I would see these be separate work streams that would run in a waterfall manner. And then what we would look to do in the planning phase is to identify key milestones where, for example, the Paymentforce integration will be ready by date X. Therefore, none of the Salesforce build use cases could be delivered before then. Likewise, the Sales Cloud migration and the partner Payment Force integration are items that we would want to prioritize and get finalized as soon as possible. But the requirements are all known, so I think that could be planned out. So I would say we're going to run multiple work streams, Salesforce build as agile, and then our migration and integration tasks will be waterfall.
Yep. Okay. You also mentioned that you wanted to keep the original GET website alive for the adventurers. How do you see that with relation to the community? Were there any particular considerations why you didn't want to just replace everything by the community?
I think we certainly could look at replacing it all with the community. I mean, maybe that could be a phase 2. As it were. My reading of the requirements, it didn't seem that there was any great advantage in swapping that out initially. In terms of how could we integrate, we could make use of something like CloudFront in order to take care of providing consistent URL for the users. Which would allow them to access the existing website and the community URLs. I think it's really, with again sort of going back to the governance and the team structure, it looked to me like there was the trade-off there is limited benefit in terms of simplifying the landscape versus additional complexity of managing it. There wasn't anything that called out that the existing website, was a problem or needed replacing. So I think on that basis, I would prefer to keep.
In terms of your choice of using the opportunity light items and products objects, what made you decide to use these objects rather than going for custom objects?
Yeah, it's always a trade-off. What led me to this was that we have customer accounts and we have partner accounts, and they're effectively coming to us with an opportunity, a business opportunity. So initially that's an opportunity. We've then got to deal with the 10 instances. Those 10 instances could be for the same product, right? So again, it's the Machu Picchu 2019, and then what's the thing that's different? It's really the dates that they're available for sale. So if there's an opportunity, if there's the ability to use a standard object, I would. And so in that case, I went with opportunity line item. I would contrast that against what I did for booking. So booking initially looked like it might be an order, but if it's an order, we'd need to maintain a contract for that, and there didn't seem to be any advantage in doing so. And so for booking, I went for a custom object.
Okay, so I just want to bring you back to that. So what you've just described is that you would have a product, and then which would be the tour 2019, and then the line items would be the dates.
Yeah.
What are the challenges that you would face in displaying those dates to external users in a community?
I think it would really depend on the experience. I mean, if there's particular requirements around, providing a slick presentation, and one of the other examples was the ability to have a map showing the different locations that were available. I'd make use of a custom component in order to be able to display the information. So we don't necessarily have to show them 10 line items on a page. Instead, we could render that information inside a calendar or in some kind of summary, where they could choose the date period in which they were interested, for example.
Okay. Are there any sharing considerations around that?
So the access for so the products would be visible to the customer community users. I don't think there's any issue there. In terms of the ability for customer community users to access the opportunity line item information. So we've got a couple of choices here. If we want to use a share set, then we would need a direct relationship between the account and the opportunity line item. So we could certainly put in a redundant relationship like that. But I think it would come down to implementation around, what's the experience that we want to produce. I would say that we could use an Apex controller without sharing in order to be able to query that information. It's only reference data. It's not, there's not really an issue there, I think, around having to tie it rigidly to user level access. So I would say it will be a Apex controller without sharing in order to retrieve the information.
Okay, thank you. You also one of the users being able to log in using Facebook. Could you talk us through how that would work?
Yeah, so this is our user, and they want to access Salesforce URL, so the community URL. We will have set up the social authentication providers that we would like to support. So let's take Facebook as the example. So the Facebook authentication provider will be configured inside Salesforce. We'll need to create an Apex class, which is going to actually go through the process of physically creating the user record inside Salesforce. That will get initiated when the user goes to log into the Salesforce URL. We don't have a session for that user, therefore we're going to redirect them to Facebook. So let's just add that on here. So I can draw this for the sake of space. I'll draw it on the landscape, but in red. So the user will seek to access Salesforce. We don't have a session for them, so the reply will go back to the user's browser and they will be redirected to Facebook, whereby they'll be challenged with the credentials page. That will then be submitted, that will then be entered by the user, and then will be submitted back to Salesforce. Salesforce will then call to Facebook endpoint directly in order to exchange the token which was available, which was sent back through the previous request, and in response we'll get back the information about the user, so their name and their email address. Those values will then be used by the provisioning class in order to create the user's record, and then finally the response will go back to the user's browser, granting them access to the requested resource.
Okay, thank you. Also, you mentioned using Okta as an identity provider, and could you talk us through and draw out the flow that would be used to provision that user, to enable that user to log in for the first time and then again in subsequent times?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways that could be achieved. So the easy way for that to be achieved is that the Okta product itself makes use of the Salesforce API in terms of setting up Salesforce user records for new users as they're added into Active Directory, or inactivating them when they are removed or deactivated inside Active Directory. If we weren't using that add-on, then we would need to do some just-in-time provisioning, and that would take place as part of the login flow. So if this is our user with their browser, they are going to access a particular resource inside Salesforce. So let's say it's an account record. So this would be SP init SAML. So they would look to request to Salesforce. We don't have a session ID for them, so the response would go back instructing them to redirect to the IDP. The request will then go to the IDP. They'll be presented with the login page for those credentials, which they will then provide. Once they've entered their credentials, those will be validated by Okta. It takes care of the sync with Active Directory for the credentials. And then if the result is positive, then the response will go back to the user with the session ID and including the relay state, where the relay state is the original URL that they wanted to access. And then finally the browser would redirect to that URL in order to access the Salesforce protected resource, and the response would come back and the user is looking at the data they wanted with an established session.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Matt, I have a few questions. So you talked about, because this is a global application, can you help me understand your choice of global currencies and how would you differentiate them between their actual transactional currencies, the reporting currencies?
So I proposed a single org with the multiple regions which go across the different geographies, different languages. So in the presentation I did talk about the language requirements. I didn't talk about the multi-currency requirements. So we'll enable advanced multi-currency inside Salesforce, and those exchange rates could then be managed through the appropriate business process. In terms of reporting, we'll need to make use of the exchange rates in order, depending on whether or not people want to see the value in local currency or in in central currencies, so whether it's dollars or euros, for example. If it's going to be centralized, then what we'll need to do is we'll need to add the appropriate custom fields to the objects involved. So I think typically this will be the opportunity and the opportunity line item in order to be able to calculate the value in the central currency, and then it would be those fields that will be used within reporting.
Okay. You spoke about a piece where you were integrating the payment for system with, to track the creditor ID, and I believe you mentioned using an outbound message as a solution over there. So can you just talk me through as to how you envision that solution to work, especially considering that there is a creditor ID piece which needs to go back to the respective record and this on the Salesforce side?
Yeah, absolutely. So this particular integration is not time dependent. We don't have an end user waiting on the screen. The requirement is that the value that's generated by the payment force system, the creditor ID, is updated to the Salesforce account record for that tour operator. So the way that I would approach it would be this. We're making use of an ESB, and I have elected to centralize as many of my integrations as possible through the ESB, and this is one of those. So the record will be updated in Salesforce. There will be a workflow rule with an outbound message. That outbound message has a SOAP payload which we have defined. So we will have previously advised that WSDL to the developers working on the ESB, and they would have created an endpoint which is able to consume that message, and they would have provided us with that endpoint for us to configure our outbound message. Now that the setup's been completed, the outbound message will be fired with the payload. We would have included the session ID, the option to include the session ID within that. So the outbound message would go, it's got the payload which can then be processed by the ESB. The ESB will act as a broker and a protocol adapter in order to send the additional message to payment force and wait for that transaction to complete. Once that transaction is completed and we get the reply back, the ESB has got an active session ID that it's going to be able to use to call back into Salesforce using the REST API in order to update the appropriate account record.
How can you just help me understand how would the session ID piece work in assuming that the transaction is going to take long and you may not have an active session by the time the transaction completes? So how would the session ID help in that case?
Sure. So, let's say that the transaction does take longer than an hour. Perhaps it's due to overnight processing or whatever. In that case, we would change the configuration of the outbound message. We wouldn't make use of the session ID anymore, and instead, what we would do is we would configure a connected app inside Salesforce and enable it for OAuth with a OAuth scope of API. The consumer key and consumer secret would then be securely shared with the ESB developers, and then they would be able to make a web server OAuth flow in order to obtain a session ID. They would also be able to obtain a refresh token. To provide that, give them an access token. They would also be able, because it's a web server flow, to get a refresh token, and thereby a one-time setup process would set up that integration to be able to have a session ID to get back in.
Okay, could you draw that out for us, Matt?
Yep. I'll find a little bit of room here. So we're going to have the ESB and we're going to have Salesforce. And then in terms of obtaining the tokens, we're going to need an administrator to set that up one time from their browser. I mean, we could do it with basic authentication, username and password, but that's not optimal. So what we're going to have is the user is going to access the URL inside Salesforce. From their browser. That's going to go against the Salesforce authorization endpoint using the consumer key. If we don't have a token, no, it's gone completely out of my head. I fluffed that one. Next question.
That's okay.
I knew you'd get to me in the end. I don't know why they call Big Bang a Big Bang. It's never good, is it? So, certainly we could look to go region by region. I think there wasn't anything particularly in the scenario which kind of helps this decision. So I think the considerations would be this. I think we would be looking for any emerging regions to be the ones that we would start with first. So those that have got less debt. So possibly those with a lower number of tour operators in the region, ones that don't already have an existing Salesforce Sales Cloud. Perhaps they're already just using spreadsheets. That could be a good place where we could start. It would also mean that we could go, the project would have the opportunity to define those standard business processes, because a couple of times it does call out the need to standardize. So I think we would start with that and get some early success. It would also allow us to test out the ways of working between the different silos within the organization. And then we would then look to ramp up into the larger projects. So the other assumption I'm making is that if we're working in the emerging markets, that the projects overall might be smaller in terms of duration until we get into the regions where there are the most tour operators with the greatest number of existing systems. We would then get into those in the next phase.
Okay.
Okay, so given the challenges that they've had with some regressions that have taken place in quarterly releases, we're looking to figure out the environment and config management strategy. So could you could you give us some advice on how you would manage this, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of environments, we'd look to split it into as few as possible, but as finely as is needed to have correct separation. So I think we would start with our dev environments, and our dev environments are less managed, as it were. So from a Salesforce sandbox point of view, these would all be developer sandboxes. Each developer would have their own, whether they want to use Scratch orgs or just standard developer orgs. I think really is less of a concern for the project overall. I think both are acceptable, and over the lifetime of the project, the maturity of DX and Scratch orgs might improve. But then we're going to enter into the next environment, which is integration. This will be a single sandbox, so assuming we have limitless resources, this would be something like a developer pro. So these are developer pro, and this is where a build manager would manage the process of taking the latest modifications from each of the developer and getting them to all work together. If they don't, then it'll get referred back to the developer who was responsible. Once we have a working build, that can then move forward into our QA environment. This is where we can do regression testing. And also our end-to-end tests. This is also the place where we will likely have our test integrations with our external systems. So in particular, Paymentforce, Service Pro, and the ESB. And then from QA, we should now have our candidate build, which is available in pre-prod. So from a Salesforce sandbox point of view, this is a full copy. This QA one could be a partial copy. And then finally, we're into production, which is live. Now, in terms of how the promotion of changes takes place, I would advocate the use of a modern source-driven approach here. So we will have a Git repository with a branching strategy, and I think there's a number of considerations which need to be taken into account here. But I think from a branching point of view, the developer changes would be feature branches. They would then come into the dev branch at our integration level, and then that can be moved through the environment until once we go to live, it gets on the master branch. This would allow changes to be managed within the development environment and then promoted through. At each point, they can be moved from source into their relevant Salesforce environment. And in order to facilitate that, we'd make use of a third-party tool. So something like a GearSet or a Capado would help with that.
Okay, so you're merging from master branch into each individual environment as the testing is taking place. Is that correct?
So I think there's a trade-off. There's always a trade-off here between having far too many branches and collapsing things too soon. So in terms of what's the most appropriate approach here, I think this would be something we'd need to get into in more detail. But certainly you could look to continue the branching strategy as far as the pre-prod before you merge. I think given the complexity of the number of systems involved here and also the multi-region consideration, I would probably favour having more granular branches and persisting those further through the process before ultimately collapsing them down.
Okay, thank you. And just finally as well, at which point do you see user acceptance testing and data migration taking place in this strategy?
Yeah, so I think with reference to the phases as well, this is sort of our life cycle once we're established. I think with the data migration project, for example, that's something where we would be looking ultimately to do testing of that in a full copy sandbox so that we could get timings for the overall data migration. There was concern that it's going to take up to a week. So that's why earlier on I would recommend that the data migration project and the integration with Paymentforce be prioritized so that we can get those out of the way. So certainly full copy for that. Integration testing with other systems would I would see take place in what I'm calling the QA environment. In terms of user acceptance testing, I think it can happen in a couple of places depending on the context. So I think in the scenario it was talking about concern over making sure that there was accountability and sign-off. So I would propose that would take place within the QA environment so that we're then on solid ground as we move into the pre-prod environment. In terms of end user acceptance and training, that could take place in our pre-prod environment.
Okay. Anyone else got any questions?
Yes, what do you see as some of the biggest risks for this implementation project?
Well, I think there's numerous risks. I think what I would look to do to mitigate the biggest ones. So certainly the siloed nature of the current operations is a concern. So we have the internal IT and the external IT, along with a PMO and a security team. I think we're going to need to make sure that we get top level buy-in to, if not change this structure, certainly augment it with an agreed steering committee and possibly an architecture, and certainly an architecture review board in order to make sure that technical design choices are centrally governed. There seems to be reference within the scenario to accountability and sign-off. So I think end to end, we would be looking to make sure that requirements are identified and labelled and tracked. So through a Jigar or a similar system to that. I think as well we would look to try and minimize the timelines end to end on the overall migration of the 7 regions to standardize them as soon as possible. So I think again that comes back to having sufficient resources available to do what's a considerable amount of engineering in order to get the additional systems, the existing legacy systems integrated.
Is there any of the requirements of the entire requirements package that you would want to challenge or drop to make for a better solution or less risky implementation or whatever?
I think I called out a couple. So I mean, we've got the opportunity to get rid of the LDAP. I think there may be, depending on the other systems which are in play, on desktops, there might be the ability to go fully cloud. I think it really depends on, are they making use of desktop policies, that Active Directory needs to support. I think anywhere that we can look to, either remove systems or go to, a common off-the-shelf solution, that would be better. I think the one system that I would look for them to be replaced, if not now, then certainly as the follow-on to this would really be payment force. So I think from a payment provider point of view, card issuer, there are hosted solutions which would do that. So we could remove that roadblock of all of this testing and governance, and also move the responsibility of the PCI compliance from being fully on the company to being a responsibility that's shared with a third party specialist. So I think this is probably the one to look at, and I think that would really be with reference to the impact that it has on the overall delivery schedule. If the fixed windows that we have for releasing and the additional testing that's required around this system become a real problem, then it might be worth re-evaluating this to see if replacement would be better.
Shall we stop torturing him now?
There's 4 minutes left.
4 minutes left.
I think that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any more? Why don't you make me try and draw my OAuth flow that I can't remember how to draw because I haven't looked at it for ages.
Because I'm stupid. So you've talked about methodology, you've talked about deployment and release strategy. How do you handle the environment around approvals and from legal being required for customer-facing applications? You may have organised this.
Yeah, that's something that we put into the governance process. So, I think there's a steerco which would be chaired by the project sponsor, and then if there's either within that environment or within a legal and security review session, which could happen monthly or quarterly, issues around security and sign-off could be addressed there.
Okay, and finally, adventurers can only view their own contact information, tour bookings and assistance requests they've made themselves. How is your solution handling that?
Yeah, which page is that one on, sorry?
That one is on page 5, under accessibility requirements, probably the 3rd bullet up from the bottom.
Yeah, so so they would have access to their own contact information through now you get me second guessing. Well, cases, so let's do cases first. So cases they would access via a share set, and one of the criteria on the share set would be, who would be a custom field on the case that said who raised the case. So whether it was raised by the contact or whether it was raised by an internal resource, in which case it's an internal case. In terms of their own contact record, yes, they'll be able to see that implicitly. And tour bookings. Yeah, again, it would be a share set for the tour booking. We can have a redundant relationship with the account, so it's the contact themselves who's created it, but it's account of contact, so redundant relationship there would take care of that.
Okay, I do have one more around that. So if I'm an internal user and I need to look at adventurers and their tour bookings, how would that be enabled within Salesforce?
You broke up a little bit there. Could you say it again?
So if I'm an internal user and I want to see what my community users have been logging through their bookings and their adventure questions and things like that. What do you need to use in Salesforce to enable me to access that data?
If we needed it, we'd make use of a share group if there were records that were owned by yes. So the external users will own their own contact record, so that could be accessed by internal users through a share group.
Okay, thank you. All right, are we done?
Nice timing.